Chris, you still there?
Yes, sir. I'm still here.
Yeah, so I'm trying to change the background. Is there a way to change that background?
So let's see. If you click on audio and video,
Right.
and then there should be something that says change virtual background.
Ah, there it is.
There you go.
Aha.
You do have mountains behind you.
You have several different options that you have. There's not a lot there that's available, but there are several different ones to choose from.
And we're fine with any of those, right?
Yes.
Okay, you see that, and then how to get-
Let's see if that works. There we go. Is that okay that way, Chris?
Yes, sir. That's fine.
Chris, this is Mike Roberts. I just want to make sure my sound is okay. I put some earbuds in.
Yes, sir. Your sound is still perfect. You're coming through loud and clear.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 2167 Rayburn. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Chris, this is Larry. Just testing in the room.
Yep, can hear you loud and clear.
All right, excellent.
They still have the timer up top, but I'm assuming that'll be away.
Yeah,
when it
that,
actually
yeah, that,
starts, correct?
yep, that'll go away.
Okay. Hello, Ben. This is Chris with the support staff. Can we get an audio and visual check from you?
Yeah, he's asking for an audio check.
And I can hear you, but visually we don't see anything on the screen.
What I gotta do here? I didn't do anything different from yesterday. It's showing my,
Yeah, we're seeing video.
Yeah, we can't see you. So if you click at the top at audio and video and then go to camera,
hold on, where do you see that? Okay,
Right there. Camera.
camera. Okay.
and what does it say that you're using for your
This
camera?
one? This one?
That one.
Oh, there we go. I got my IT guy in here helping me too.
Okay, hold on. It's switching something. Says you have low bandwidth. Okay, there we go. Now we see you.
So you're all good to go on your end, bud?
Yes, sir. And we can hear you loud and clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'll go on mute now?
Sure. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
The subcommittee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. For members participating remotely, I want to remind you of key regulations from the House Committee on Rules. Members must be visible on video to be considered in attendance and to participate unless experiencing connectivity issues. Members must also continue to use the video function for the remainder of the time they are attending this meeting and hearing unless experiencing connectivity issues or other technical problems. If a member is experiencing any connectivity issues or other technical problems, please inform committee staff as soon as possible so you can receive assistance. A chat function is available for members on the Cisco WebEx platform for this purpose. Members can also call the committee's main phone line at 202-225-4472. 202-225-4472 for technical assistance by phone. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. However, for security reasons, members may maintain a connection to the software platform while not in attendance. It is the responsibility of each member seeking recognition to unmute their microphone prior to speaking and to keep their microphone muted when not speaking to avoid inadvertent background noise. As the chair of today's meeting and hearing, I will make a good faith effort to provide every member experiencing connectivity issues an opportunity to participate fully in the proceedings. And finally, to insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documenttni@mail.house.gov. With that, I will proceed to my opening statement. Good morning and welcome to the first Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation Subcommittee hearing in the 117th Congress. Today, we will examine the state of the United States maritime industry amid the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. It is an honor to chair this vital subcommittee, and I look forward to working alongside my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support our maritime community and United States Coast Guard. The maritime transportation system is vast and complex. It touches virtually every aspect of American life, from movement of passengers, the clothes we wear, to the cars we drive and the fuel in those vehicles. When it is working well, it is easy to forget the importance of our maritime system, as well as the Coast Guard, and as chair, I will strive to uplift this important sector. The Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation has a long history of bipartisan cooperation, and I look forward to working with Ranking Member Gibbs to conduct oversight and pass important legislation to support our maritime industry and the Coast Guard. I'm sorry we cannot physically meet in person today for this important first subcommittee hearing. I am sure, though, that we will rise to the challenge to conduct the important business nonetheless. I also want to thank the former subcommittee chair, Sean Patrick Maloney, for the great work he did last Congress. He worked tirelessly to improve our Coast Guard and to strengthen the U.S. maritime industry, and we will work to build upon those efforts. He leaves big shoes to fill. The United States maritime industry includes four major components: the internationally trading U.S. flag fleet, the domestic trades, also, or the Jones Act, shipbuilders and U.S. ports, commercial shipping carriers, more than 95% by volume of U.S. overseas trade, and yet the presence of U.S. flag fleet operating in international trade is diminishing. In the past 35 years, we've seen the U.S. flag fleet drop from over 850 vessels to merely 85. Let me say that again. From over 850 vessels to merely 85. The United States Merchant Marine, which provides a living wage to its American mariners, pays taxes in America, and complies with American regulations, simply cannot compete with foreign fleets that pay little to no taxes, comply with the bare minimum regulations, and pay substandard wages. The Merchant Marine Act of 1920, or Jones Act, safeguards our country and economy and provides guaranteed work to American merchant mariners, ensuring government and civilian goods. People and equipment are carried by U.S. flagged ships and U.S. citizens. The domestic Jones Act trade includes more than 41,000 vessels, not including fishing vessels. In my district, which encompasses Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo counties and a portion of Ventura County, maritime and seafaring is an essential way of life, with the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach just to the south and the Pacific Ocean to the west. Our community is rich in maritime history or heritage. My district is home to a vibrant passenger vessel industry, but in the wake of this pandemic, much of the industry has had to shut down its business and furlough employees. Many passenger vessels operating in the Jones Act trade have lost the entirety of their 2020 operating season. Of the companies operating, most have experienced reductions in revenue by as much as 90% and have laid off or furloughed as much as 80% of their employees. And while passenger vessels and ferries are one of the few sectors of the maritime industry to receive federal assistance, they were left out. They were left to compete for this assistance with other modes of passenger transportation. The remainder of the maritime industry has left to fend for itself. Operators have had to shoulder the burden of increased costs of new safety measures, acquiring protective gear and complying with public health measures, while other industries have received federal assistance. Requests for assistance have gone unanswered, while demand on our ports and cargo carrying U.S. fleet only increases as American commerce increases. I applaud President Biden for affirming support for the Jones Act. The industry needs strong federal support in order to weather this storm. One way to provide immediate assistance is by funding the Maritime Transportation Emergency Relief Program that was passed into law last Congress under the leadership of Chairman DeFazio. For the first time, it created a program within the Maritime Administration to provide financial assistance to the maritime industry in times of national emergency. We need to utilize this program and provide funding to protect American maritime jobs and assist operators struggling to stay afloat. As we gather here today to hear from our witnesses on the current state of the U.S. maritime industry, I want to take a moment to stop and thank you, to our maritime workforce. These crucial frontline workers show up day in and day out to ensure our shelves are stocked and that Americans get their essentials, while also facing their share of danger and loss from COVID-19. Without your dedication, we would not be able to weather this storm. So thank you. My hope is that this hearing will help inform the committee of the ongoing difficulties facing the maritime industry and identify areas of support that will allow the industry to emerge stronger than when the pandemic began. We must ensure the marine transportation system continues to operate seamlessly, and we must protect these essential frontline workers. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. I now call on Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, Mr. Gibbs, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Carvajal, and congratulations on your first hearing as the Chair of the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation. I look forward to working with you in this 117th Congress. I'd also like to welcome to the subcommittee two new subcommittee members on our side of the aisle. Jeff Van Drew, who represents the U.S. Coast Guard Training Center, Cape May, through which all enlisted members of the Coast Guard enter their service, and the district formerly held by the long-serving chairman of the subcommittee, Frank Lombriando, and Nicholas Maliotakis, who represents the U.S. Coast Guard Sector New York and Station New York, which are both located on Staten Island. I also thank the witnesses for attending from wherever they are located today. I would like to know more about the reports that the U.S. ag exporters are having trouble finding sufficient containers to meet the needs of U.S. exporters. I am interested in hearing from witnesses whether the pressure is swiftly return empty boxes to China has impacted that availability of containers for U.S. ag exports. I am particularly interested to learn if the ag exports have been delayed or they have switched back to the use of bulk shipping of ag commodities. At the very end of the last Congress, the Maritime Transportation Emergency Relief Program was authorized as part of the National Defense Authorization Act of FY21. I support the adoption of that program as part of the T&I Committee amendment, which also included assistance for port development and mariner education and training. No funds have been provided. No funds have been provided. No funds have been provided for this program. 38 maritime organizations, including 2 represented here today, have sent a letter to Congress seeking emergency relief under the new program. The letter emphasizes an overall annual decrease in maritime commerce in 2020. However, the letter does not address the unprecedented surge in traffic at U.S. ports, which has occurred since August and is expected to last through this spring. I am interested in hearing from the witnesses what the industry's emergency relief needs are in light of the ongoing historic increase in container traffic at U.S. ports, and we're especially seeing bottlenecks on our LA and Long Beach ports. And I know that today the Wall Street Journal even had an article about that. Finally, I understand that the myriad of new conflicting and ad hoc travel restrictions around the world has led to delays in planned crew changes. This has left many mariners trapped on their ships, unable to disembark or travel through the countries from which they were scheduled to depart for home. I have read that as many as 300,000 mariners have been caught on ships well past the point at which they were due to rotate off. I am interested in whether any U.S. mariners have faced these difficulties, and if so, what actions have been taken to allow reasonable crew changes to proceed. Again, I look forward to learning of the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on the U.S. maritime transportation system, ranging from U.S. shipbuilder and operators to our ports and marine terminal operators. Thank you, Chairman, and I yield back, and thank you for all the workers out there that are doing their best, as you said, fighting, trying to do all this under these tense, on these challenging times of COVID-19. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. I now would like to recognize our chairman of the T&I Committee, Mr. DeFazio.
Thanks, Chairman Carbajal, and congratulations on your new position. I know you represent a good section of coast there in California, and I know you have a deep interest in maritime issues. You know, the pandemic, you know, we're about to do another COVID relief package. We've done several. Unfortunately, the maritime industry has not been included in any of these. As the chairman said, I did write and we did pass the Maritime Transportation System Emergency Relief Act last Congress, was in the National Defense Authorization and became law on January 1st. You know, we're giving the Maritime Administration specific emergency authority to distribute financial relief and assistance to any dramatically impacted links in the supply chain during times of emergency, whether it's a pandemic or something else. And we're here today, hopefully, to begin to make the case to our fellow colleagues on the Appropriations Committee that this is something that should be funded this next year. Beyond that, the chairman touched on the issue of the Jones Act and the fact that the U.S. fleet has shrunk to a minuscule size in international trade. We cannot and should not have to compete with foreign flag vessels that are flagged in countries that really don't exist, like Liberia. It used to be the Coast Guard. A couple of retired coasties were running Liberia out of an office in Virginia. I don't know if they still are. And as I've said to you know, those in the particularly in the cruise industry, you know, if you need help, call the Liberian Navy. Oh, they don't have one. You know, we simply have to rebuild our domestic fleet, and the Jones Act is absolutely key to that. And this president has already mentioned his strong support for the Jones Act, unlike the last one who didn't even know what it was, and his feckless so-called economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, who wanted to grant waivers or do away with the Jones Act. So I think we're beginning a building phase for America here, or a rebuilding phase. We used to be a great maritime nation. We can be one again, but we can't compete with virtual slave labor, poorly maintained ships, et cetera. So it's time to strike out, level the playing field, and rebuild. As our president says, build back better, and we are going to build back better. With that, I yield back to balance my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, let me move on to our T&I committee ranking member, Mr. Graves. But before you go, Mr. Graves, I wanted to take a minute to also recognize the other Graves on the committee, Garrett Graves, for sending us all those wonderful king cakes. Thank you very much. I was going to thank Sam Graves, and I realized it was Garrett Graves who sent us those cakes. So thank you very much. With that, Mr. Graves. Actually, I am just informed that Mr. Graves is not here, so we will move on. I now would like to welcome the witnesses on our panel. First, we have Ms. Lauren Brand, President of the National Association of Waterfront Employers, Mr. Ben Bordelon, Chairman of the Shipbuilders Council of America, Mr. Mario Cordero, Executive Director, Port of Long Beach, on behalf of the American Association of Port Authorities, Mr. Jim Patty, President, Maritime Institute for Research and Industrial Development, on behalf of the USA Maritime, Mr. Michael Roberts, Senior Vice President, Crowley Maritime, on behalf of the American Maritime Partnership, and Mr. Dal Wilkins, President, Illinois Marine Towing, Inc., on behalf of American Waterways Operators. Thank you for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. Before we begin, I would like to recognize Representative Garrett Graves to say a few words about Mr. Bordelon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad you enjoyed the Mardi Gras king cake. I want to introduce Mr. Ben Bordelon, who's president of the Shipbuilders Council of America. Of course, that's the National Trade Association that represents all of the domestic shipbuilders, the shipyards that often repair our Navy and Coast Guard vessels and build that fleet, as well as commercial vessels in every class, in accordance with the Jones Act. And that's really what represents our industrial base in the shipbuilding industry. Ben grew up in South Louisiana. We represent a large number of the employees of Bollinger Shipyard. He was a graduate of LSU, where he was all SEC football player. And I see my friend, Mr. Lowenthal, Alan, he went on to play professional ball for the Chargers over in California. But Ben's one of those guys that worked his way up from project manager to vice president for repair and ultimately the CEO of the company. Most importantly, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing about how this important economic engine in South Louisiana, Bollinger Shipyards, and of course, wearing the hat as the president of the Shipbuilders Council, how these shipyards all across the country are faring during COVID, and to hear how we could best provide support to the shipbuilding industry around the United States in terms of trying to help them sustain through this COVID pandemic, including possibly through the markup we're going to be doing tomorrow. So I welcome Mr. Bordelon and all the witnesses and look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. I now would like to recognize Representative Davis to say a few words about Mr. Wilkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to you on your new assignment as chair of this subcommittee. As a guest of the subcommittee, I doubt I am able to come and sit at many of your hearings, but I wish you and also Ranking Member Gibbs the best. And I will say too, especially succeeding my good friend, Mr. Maloney, the bar is pretty low for success for you after Sean Patrick. So you're going to be able to do extremely well. And we got a lot of high hopes for you, Mr. Carbajal. And I do want to also say thanks to Garrett Graves, too, for the king cakes. And I certainly hope that none of you got the same note I did that actually told me he wished I would choke on the plastic baby found inside. But I took that as a joke, not an insult from my fellow colleague on our side of the aisle and my good friend from Louisiana. But I am here to actually introduce a very good friend of mine, and that is Dell Wilkins. Dell is a champion for waterways and workers in the industries that use the waterways, not just in my home state of Illinois, his home state of Illinois, but throughout our nation. He currently serves as the president of Illinois Marine Towing and the vice president of Northern Operations and Business Development at Canal Barge. And additionally, he serves as the Waterways Chairman on the Illinois Chamber of Commerce Infrastructure Council and as a board member of the American Waterways Operators Association. As someone who's spent most of his career in the waterways industry, there is no doubt Mr. Wilkins will provide a wealth of knowledge at today's hearing on the state of the U.S. maritime industry. I looked at the rest of the witnesses too. I'm honored to be able to sit here in this subcommittee with you all today. And I do want to thank my friend Dell for testifying. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Ms. Brand, you may proceed.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Carbajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Lauren Brand, and I'm the president of the National Association of Waterfront Employers. The members of NAWI and I thank you for this opportunity to relay what we are experiencing during these unprecedented times. NAWI is the voice for U.S. Marine Terminal operators, stevedores, and operating port authorities. Our members are U.S. entities who are responsible for safely and securely transporting freight and passengers between vessels, trucks, and rail at ports in 34 states and Puerto Rico. Terminals are located on the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf coasts, the Great Lakes, and the Inland Waterway System. Members also include the associations responsible for labor relations and contract negotiations with the ILA and ILWU in all coastal states. NAWI's members hire labor, fund the purchase of cargo moving equipment, construct intermodal infrastructure, and design systems that track each shipment. I will present 3 issues today. Prioritize vaccinations in authorized ports as CDC-approved inoculation sites. Address funding of the Maritime System Emergency Relief Program. And promote innovative port and intermodal infrastructure assistance programs for a network of transportation corridors versus modal silos. The health and safety of frontline port workers remains our #1 priority. We have redesignated operating areas and implemented protocols that meet or exceed CDC guidelines. Now we need vaccines for women and men who work on the waterfront. To quote the leaders of the ILA, ILWU, PMA, and USMX, in recent weeks, COVID infections among frontline workers have reached crisis levels in many locations. At the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, almost as many longshore workers tested positive in the first 3 weeks of 2021 as in the first 10 months of the pandemic. Other port regions report similar troubling increases. At times, we are facing a shortage of workers. We respectfully request that the CDC work with states to designate gateway port authorities and terminals as sites where all essential waterfront and transportation workers can be inoculated. NAWI's members thank Chairman DeFazio and members of this committee for their leadership and steadfast support for America's maritime industry. Our members handle containers filled with consumer goods and manufacturing parts, bulk products needed to build roads, U.S.-grown agriculture, and U.S. manufactured cars and heavy equipment exported to other nations, petroleum products needed to propel trucks, trains, planes, and automobiles, and yes, they handle millions of units of PPE and equipment needed to fight COVID. They are also responsible for the safe, secure transfer of passengers, luggage, and provisions onto and off of large and small vessels, a sector of the industry that's been devastated. MTSERA is the only program that's been made available to this sector to defray costs incurred since March 2020 fighting to safely work. Yesterday, the reconciliation amendment was issued with no funding for the industries covered in MITSERA. We respectfully encourage this committee to consider funding MITSERA. Additionally, yesterday, amendments to the Longshore Act, which are highly detrimental to maritime employers, have been proposed without consideration or action by this committee. I welcome the opportunity to discuss this important issue further during during this hearing's Q&A session. The U.S. transportation system was designed in response to the market. The market controls all cargo orders, builds distribution centers to accommodate shipments, and orders the trucks, chassis, and rail cars needed to move it all. A consumer shift from buying services to buying goods has led to the saturation of the maritime lane in the Pacific Southwest and pushed this part of the import supply chain to its limits. The volumes flowing through this trade lane change faster than the system can reinvent itself. The good news is that union dock workers have been reliable partners in eastbound rail transits, have sustained scheduled services. And while these challenges are most pronounced in one region of our nation, they demonstrate the risk to the system posed by the current pandemic. We encourage the development of port and intermodal infrastructure assistance programs and policies that address our system as a network of transportation corridors versus modal silos. For the record, I must let you know that the U.S. Coast Guard has applied common sense and been very thorough while conducting their mission in interactions with marine terminal operators and stevedores during this pandemic, and for that we thank them. In summary, NAUI's members remain committed to ensuring the intermodal transportation needs of the U.S. are met, and we look forward to your leadership in the 117th Congress and your continued support for the maritime industry.
Thank you, Ms. Brand. Mr. Bordelon, you could proceed.
Thank you. And on behalf of the Shipbuilders Council of America, I would like to thank Chairman Carbajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the committee for the opportunity to provide testimony on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic to the U.S. shipyard industry. I ask that my entire testimony be submitted for the record. I'm here today as chairman of SCA, which represents both shipyards and suppliers that comprise the critical domestic shipyard industrial base. I'm a proud third-generation shipbuilder, and I serve as president and CEO of Bollinger Shipyards in South Louisiana. Founded as a machine shop by my grandfather, Donald Bollinger, in 1946. Here we are 75 years later, and still today remain the largest privately owned and operated shipbuilder in the United States. The U.S. shipyard industrial base is a diverse and critical manufacturing sector of our nation's economy. Shipyards are engaged in designing, building, maintaining, and repairing vessels of all sizes, government customers, local and state governments, and the 40,000 commercial vessels that operate in domestic commerce. While our industry has faced enormous challenges throughout the pandemic, I'm proud to report that as a designated essential industry, your American shipyards never shut down. Our workers continue cutting steel and coming to work despite some very challenging circumstances. In response to the pandemic, the SCA established an emergency COVID-19 task force that met weekly starting March 2020. The task force gathered information and shared industry best practices amongst our membership, our federal partners, and with Congress. Shipyards responded immediately and took action by establishing their own crisis response teams and implementing new policies, like limiting company travel and modifying work and shift schedules. In addition, managing supply chain disruptions became essential to mitigate production delays. Because of the pandemic, the biggest drivers of schedule and cost impacts have increased rates of absenteeism, sometimes as high as 30% at some of our member yards. Unexpected loss of supervision and delayed equipment deliveries due to supply chain challenges. While these and other COVID-related costs have impacted every area of our business, from our workforce and finance teams to our IT and technical infrastructure, they have been and remain necessary to keep our people safe and our programs on schedule. SCA and its members are appreciative of Congress passing the CARES Act in 2020, but the scale of the pandemic's impact have grown since then. The lack of appropriate funds for pandemic-related expenses has placed a significant burden on the shipyard industrial base due to the uncertainty of if, when, and how reimbursements may come. As the Congress considers recovery efforts, SCA would support incentivizing investment in vocational training and development of critical skilled workers. The Congressman's continued support of and the administration's enforcement of existing laws will also be key to our industry's recovery in the wake of the pandemic. SCA was pleased that in the first week in office, President Biden issued an executive order reaffirming his support for the Jones Act and identifying it as a critical tool to support the development of American jobs. In addition to supporting the Jones Act, SCA encourages the Congress to provide stable and predictable budgets for the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard that are necessary to grow and sustain those fleets for national security purposes. We're very proud that our shipyards and suppliers have met the challenge of the pandemic and look forward to working with you all to continue those efforts. Thank you again, Chairman Carbajal and Ranking Member Gibbs, for allowing me today the opportunity to testify along such distinguished witnesses. I look forward to your questions. Happy Mardi Gras.
Thank you, Mr. Bordelon. Mr. Mario Cordero, you may proceed.
Good morning, Chairman Callahan, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Mario Cordero. I'm the Executive Director of the Port of Long Beach. Today, I'm testifying to you as Chairman of the Board of the American Association of Port Authorities, the unified voice of the seaport industry in the Americas. First, I would like to congratulate a fellow Californian on being named Chairman of this distinguished subcommittee in the 117th Congress. Chairman Callahan, thank you for your service to the state's ports and harbors. I would also like to thank subcommittee and the full committee chairman, Chairman DeFazio, and former Chairman Maloney, for your recognition of the important role played by the ports and your work to establish the Maritime Transportation System Emergency Relief Program and unlock the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. Finally, I would like to recognize and honor the frontline workers who have died from COVID-19. We've lost many good people. Our nation's seaports deliver vital goods for consumers, facilitate the export of American-made goods, create jobs, and support local and national economic growth. Ports also play a crucial role in our national defense, a point acknowledged through the designation of 17 of our nation's ports, including the Port of Long Beach, as strategic seaports by the Department of Defense. According to Martin & Associates, an internationally recognized economic and transportation consulting firm, prior to the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, the total economic value generated in terms of revenue to businesses, personal income, and economic output at U.S. coastal ports accounts for $5.4 trillion, roughly 26% of GDP. This research also showed over 31 million Americans are employed in jobs generated as a result of port activity. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, AAPA has remained in regular contact with members to monitor the impact of the pandemic, to communicate regarding the need for federal relief and recovery. I would like to highlight how impressive the collaboration within the industry has been. As the former chair of the Federal Maritime Commission, I am truly pleased on how the ports across the country, and in fact the world, have worked together to ensure safety of workers and minimize supply chain disruptions. Port workers are greatly impacted. In California, cases of COVID-19 among International Longshore and Warehouse Union members are captured by a dock worker self-service portal established by the Pacific Maritime Association, where members of the IOWU can report they have been tested positive and qualify for emergency aid sick relief. Since March of last year, across California, cases reported in the portal total 1,497. To protect our workforce, minimize disruptions to our maritime transportation system, and power our economic recovery, I raised the following issues to this subcommittee. Number one, we need assistance to prioritize vaccinations and provide more testing for port workers and other transportation system personnel. Two, we need Congress to fund the Maritime Transportation System Emergency Relief Program to help ports mitigate COVID-19 impacts and protect workers. The COVID-19 pandemic caused 2020 to be one of the most erratic and volatile years in terms of container volumes. By the end of the year, total waterborne trade volume was down 4.8% compared to the prior year, and the value of trade dropped 11.3%, totaling nearly $200 billion. The cruise industry was closed for nearly the entire year of 2020, without a date at this point to resume. By funding this new maritime relief program, Congress can sustain critical supply chains and ensure that maritime operations continue at a high level that Americans have come to depend on. Number 3, investments on our nation's trade infrastructure will help power economic recovery. President Biden recently spoke of the need to take a two-step approach to respond to this pandemic: rescue and recovery. The first two issues I mentioned, we focused on rescue, but it's important to also address recovery. Ports build during crisis, and we invest. We serve as an engine for economic prosperity in our communities and provide access to markets across the globe for communities nationwide. AAPA has identified $20 billion in multimodal and rail access needs at these ports. As population shifts and cargo volumes grow, we continue to embrace e-commerce. These investments will be critical to ensuring that the United States has 21st century multimodal freight network to compete globally and deliver locally. I noted in recent remarks at the Port of Long Beach that in crisis, we build. As we recover from the impacts of this pandemic, we have an opportunity to transform our infrastructure. And finally, we ask that harmful trade practices that have hurt American consumers and businesses be reevaluated. I believe we have an opportunity to reassess the country's trade and tariff policies and to assist our businesses in conducting international business. This is vital to our economy. Chairman Carvajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the subcommittee, our nation's ports are committed to sustaining critical responsibility in supply chains nationwide. Congress can help accomplish these goals. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to testify today and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cordero. Next, we have Mr. Jim Patty. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gibbs, members of the subcommittee. My name is James Patty. I am chairman of USA Maritime, a coalition that includes shipping companies operating U.S. flag vessels in our nation's foreign trades, maritime labor unions representing the men and women who crew these vessels, and their related maritime associations. Our companies own and operate the 60 militarily useful U.S. flag commercial vessels enrolled in the Maritime Security Program and carry defense and non-defense government cargoes pursuant to the U.S. flag cargo preference shipping laws. At the outset, we thank you for your support for the Maritime Security Program and for your leadership in enacting legislation to determine whether our nation's cargo preference laws are being fully enforced. We also appreciate your efforts that led to the enactment of the Maritime Transportation System Emergency Relief Act, which will, once funded, allow those in need in the maritime industry to apply for assistance and respond to COVID-19 or other emergency. Since the onset of the pandemic, the companies and unions in USA Maritime have worked tirelessly to protect the lives of American mariners, address the professional and personal hardships they endure because of COVID-19, and to ensure that the essential economic and defense services provided by our industry remain available. Nevertheless, and despite the essential protocols and practices put in place, more needs to be done. Most importantly, we are asking that American mariners and cadets working aboard our U.S. flag vessels be considered for expedited access to the COVID-19 vaccine. Such access will help to ensure that mariners remain available to crew the vessels necessary to support American troops deployed overseas and to protect America's economic and military security. As General Stephen Lyons, Commander, United States Transportation Command, has said, quote, "When our nation goes to war, so does the maritime industry. Today, as in the past, the Defense Department relies on U.S. flag vessels, global trade routes, and expert mariners in times of crisis," end quote. Expedited access is also important because many of these mariners already designated as critical transportation infrastructure workers, help deliver the medicine, personal protective equipment, food, and other supplies desperately needed by those suffering from COVID in our country and around the world. Due to the time spent at sea, the fact that mariners live and work closely together in multi-generational settings for months at a time, and the exposure to individuals who board their vessels in foreign ports who do not follow necessary safety procedures and protocols, mariners face a significant and elevated risk from COVID-19. These risks are exacerbated by the lack of medical care aboard ship when a crew member becomes infected while underway, and because they are all too often denied access to medical care in foreign ports. In addition, crew rotation, pre and post-employment quarantine, the repatriation of sick or injured seafarers, travel restrictions, and the need for uniform testing protocols remain major concerns for the U.S. flag shipping companies and maritime unions engaged in the U.S. international trades. Finally, Mr. Chairman, the COVID-19 pandemic has made it all too clear how vulnerable our commercial sea lift readiness capability is due to the current maritime manpower shortage, estimated by the Department of Defense to be as much as 1,800 mariners in the event of a protracted conflict. The reality is that less than 2% of America's foreign trade is carried on U.S. flag vessels. Until this is changed, the current manpower shortage will not be erased. While it may sound overly simplistic, without cargoes, vessels don't sail and mariners don't have jobs. This not only means funding and support for the programs and policies currently in place, including the cargo preference laws, the Maritime Security Program, and the newly authorized tanker security fleet, but also requires strong and innovative action on the part of our industry, Congress, and the administration. We are convinced that by working together, we can develop and implement programs and policies that will increase the amount of America's foreign trade carried aboard U.S. flag ships, increase the number of vessels operating under the U.S. flag, and increasing the number of jobs for American mariners. We are encouraged by the maritime policy objectives put forward by President Biden, including his recent Buy America executive order, which includes maritime services within its scope, as well as by the confirmation of Mayor Pete Buttigieg as Secretary of Transportation and the appointment of Ms. Lucinda Leslie as Deputy Maritime Administrator. In conclusion, on behalf of the USA Maritime Coalition, I want to again thank you and the members of this subcommittee and committee for your support. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Patty. Next, we will proceed with Mr. Michael Roberts. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Carbajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to appear before you on behalf of the American Maritime Partnership, or AMP. AMP is the largest coalition of American maritime interests ever assembled, representing almost all segments of the domestic maritime industry, producing 650,000 jobs nationwide. As in my written testimony, I would like to speak briefly today about three issues: COVID, offshore wind, and China. But I have two preliminary comments before I get to those. First, for those who may be new to American maritime, you should know that labor and management stand together on virtually every policy issue. I believe this is because of the unique role we play in promoting our national security, and it is important to recognize, especially in a highly polarized environment. Secondly, let me touch on the Jones Act, which is the legislative foundation for the American domestic maritime industry. The central requirement of the Jones Act is that those who carry cargo between two American points must use American ships with American workers and must obey American laws. Pretty simple proposition. Ships flying the flag of China or Liberia or some other flag of convenience can carry cargo in our import-export trades between America and a foreign country, but not within our domestic markets. Almost all countries that have a coastline have similar laws. The Jones Act has overwhelming bipartisan support in Congress and has been supported by every American president in modern times, including President Biden, who explicitly endorsed the Jones Act in his executive order on Buy America, and we appreciate that very much. The American maritime industry, which the Jones Act supports, has performed remarkably well through this pandemic. The character and culture of American Maritime continues to drive leaders at every level to find solutions to keep people safe and keep supply chains moving. Government agencies have also helped, providing regulatory flexibility and in other ways. We also appreciate the very important maritime legislation passed in the last Congress, including MTSERA, which has been discussed and which enables the Maritime Administration to do more. Not enough has been done yet, however, and this builds on Jim Patty's comments, to those essential frontline workers to keep them healthy. We're telling them to continue working, and the companies are doing what we can and they can to keep them safe. But for mariners, working means living on board the ship. It's a congregate living setting in CDC's terms, like a nursing home or a fire station, except that mariners live in that bubble for weeks at a time. They should have priority access to testing before entering that bubble, and they should have priority access to vaccines in phase 1B right after senior citizens and frontline healthcare workers. Next issue, the development of offshore wind power represents what may be a generational opportunity for American Maritime, producing dozens of vessels and tens of thousands of jobs. We are very grateful for the work of many current and former members of this committee in having legislation enacted by the last Congress that confirms this work is in fact in our domestic economy and subject to the Jones Act. Investment is already moving forward and jobs are being created based in part on that legislation. This is one example of American Maritime's commitment to improving sustainability, which includes cutting-edge investments to fuel cargo ships with liquefied natural gas, prototype development of electric-powered vessels, and research in many other areas of maritime sustainability. Finally, many believe that after COVID, the most significant national security challenge we face is geopolitical competition with China. The maritime industry has clearly been targeted. According to CSIS, the Chinese government has spent almost $15 billion annually for more than a decade to support its shipping and shipbuilding industry. The result is that China built 1,291 large commercial ships in 2019, compared to 8 built in the United States. More than 6,000 Chinese flagged commercial ships sailed the ocean versus less than 200 flying the US flag. We believe this demands a strong policy response. Thankfully, because of the Jones Act, we still have commercial shipbuilding in the United States, and we have a modern fleet of US flagged vessels crewed by American mariners to meet the needs of American domestic commerce. But a great deal more is obviously needed if we're going to respond effectively to China's maritime ambitions. With that, I want to thank you again, Chairman Carbajal and Ranking Member Gibbs, and we'll welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roberts. Next, we will proceed with Mr. Dell Wilkins.
Thank you. Good morning. And again, thank you for the opportunity to testify with you and before you today. And thank you, my good friend, Congressman Davis, for the introduction. Chairman Carbajal, congratulations on being selected to chair the subcommittee. We look forward to working with you to achieve our mutual goal of ensuring the safe, efficient, and environmentally responsible movement of freight on our maritime transportation system. I also extend our thanks to the bipartisan leadership of the full committee and subcommittee for your great work in the 116th Congress. In particular, the Coast Guard Authorization Bill, MTSERA, and the Waterways Resource Development Act are all greatly appreciated. And as always, we're grateful for the committee's stalwart support of the Jones Act, the statutory foundation that undergirds every dollar that companies like mine invest in American-built vessels and every job we provide to American women and men. A continuation of these good efforts will position our industry to continue to meet the country's transportation needs and support a national economic recovery. And that leads me to my main message for you today, which is that the domestic maritime industry remains resilient, but needs your support to navigate the challenges of keeping mariners healthy and vessels in service. From the beginning of the pandemic, our industry's overriding priority has been protecting mariners from COVID. while keeping vessels in service to protect the continuity of the national supply chain. Industry best practices based on CDC and U.S. Coast Guard guidelines were quickly put in place and have served as a foundation of our resilience. We're working hard to avoid disruption to regular vessel operations. However, given the heightened prevalence of COVID in the general population, towing companies are seeing increased incidents of exposure to infection off the job, which keeps mariners and other frontline workers from reporting to work. There's no question that the task is more challenging than it has ever been during and throughout this whole pandemic. At the same time, many companies are struggling with the unforeseen cost associated with this pandemic. And in the backdrop, as the ever-present need to maintain our nation's waterways infrastructure so that vessels can move safely and reliably. Taken together, these conditions pose real challenges to the critical infrastructure sector at a time when a robust supply chain is most needed. The bottom line is a healthy, fully operational domestic maritime industry is indispensable to our nation's ability to weather and recover from the twin public health and economic crises. With that in mind, I'd like to highlight 3 priorities that will help the hardworking men and women keep tugboats, towboats, and barges operating on our waterways. First, implement a national strategy for mariner vaccination. At a minimum, a clear federal guidance to states to effectively immunize these essential workers against COVID and ensure safety and continuity. To be clear, we're not asking to cut the line. We're asking to work with you and the administration to ensure that timely immunization of a relatively small segment of the country's frontline essential workforce that has an outsized impact on our economy and security. Second, we ask that you please support full funding of MITRA program. COVID-19 was an unforeseen crisis that required sufficient resources and significant resources to adapt to a radically and altered operating condition. At the same time, many companies saw steep declines in cargo volumes. Directly as a result of the economic contraction, MITRA will provide companies with additional options to bolster financial resources in preparation for a full economic recovery. Finally, we're encouraged by President Biden's early support for the large-scale infrastructure package, but we urge that any such initiative contain 3 critical elements. 1, increased funding for locks, dams, ports, and waterways. 2, accelerated construction of the Coast Guard buoy tenders, and in the interim, support the efficient use of existing buoy tenders and other resources to promote safe and reliable navigation. And 3rd, improvements to the Army Corps of Engineers contracting processes for dredges that to keep our rivers operating at congressionally authorized levels. Such a package will both increase shipper confidence in waterborne commerce, and as we recover from the pandemic, and over the long term, help secure a transformed waterway system that supports robust domestic and international trade. Furthermore, waterway transport is the most economical and environmental friendly mode of transport in the country, which makes investing in maritime infrastructure a critical component of environmental sustainability. Chairman Carvajal and Member Gibbs, working together, we can go forward to better our nation. This committee has a proven record of enacting policies beneficial to the domestic maritime industry, and let me assure you that we are suited up and ready to be a full partner in the critical year ahead. We're ready to work together and eager to help as we know you're ready to get to work. I thank you, and I'm prepared to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkins. We will now move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. Usually I would start and then go on to Ranking Member Gibbs, but we will acquiesce today to Chair DeFazio as he has another commitment he has to get to. Mr. DeFazio?
I thank the gentleman for yielding the time. I think it was Mr. Patty who said that you still can't access testing. Is that correct? The ships are being dispatched and you can't get people tested before they go?
No, it's not that we can't access testing. It's just that it's still a very disorganized and not quite as coordinated as it should be process in order to provide the uniform testing for each vessel and for all the mariners. But testing is available. It's taken a while to get to this point. In the very early stages of the pandemic, it was incredibly difficult to secure the testing that we needed. So testing is available. It's just not being handled in as uniform and as organized a fashion as we would like.
Okay, and then are we still seeing, Ms. Brand or anyone else, a lack of PPE in our ports for workers in the ports, loading, unloading cargo and that? Personal protective equipment?
Chairman DeFazio, thank you so much for the question. No, I'm not hearing of a shortage of PPE. I hear that it's flowing. I understand there are some counterfeit PPE that we're watching for and making sure our members don't get that.
Okay, that's good. Mr. Bordelon, when I was visiting your shipyard, you told me something about the acquisition of the cutter you're working on. That you started out with an order for so many, so therefore you couldn't, do forward purchasing for, I think it was the engines in particular were an issue. And, can you have any comments on the Coast Guard's contracting process without being too upsetting to them?
Sure. Yeah, and that's just exercising the cleanse in the contract. So we had some I'm talking from the Bollinger side. We had some things come up on the Bollinger side that we worked through Coast Guard with as far as getting the boats appropriated and funded so we could continue the program. And really, Chairman, that's a great point of some of the things that the shipbuilding industry needs right now is predictability and some vision going forward on budgets and awarding contracts that have longer lives than short-term opportunities for us to evaluate. Definitely help in a time like a COVID crisis to have some stability and sustainability in our workforce. And that's really what our workers are looking for from an essential business standpoint, that we need some predictability in front of us, and budgets and appropriations definitely help fix that for shipbuilders and all of our suppliers.
Okay, thank you. Just one other question. I think someone said we built 8 ships last year, 8 large vessels, commercial vessels. Did someone say that?
I did say that.
Yep.
Mike Roberts here, yes.
So
It's according
8.
to a Navy League.
And how many?
Navy
Did the Chinese build?
1,291 on the basis of $15 billion in support from the Chinese government.
Well, wait a minute. Wouldn't that be unfair competition? The Chinese government subsidizes the building of the ships. They have cheap labor.
Well, there are a lot of advantages in Chinese shipyards in addition to the financial support that they receive from the Chinese government, and the results are telling.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I just remember Mr. Kudlow, a former economic advisor to the former president, saying he really believed in free markets, and because he wanted to do away with the Jones Act. And I said, well, how is it free when we have to compete with the communist government of China? That's not a free market. Anyway, that's an extraordinary number, 8 to 1,000 versus 1,000. That is very worrisome. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. We will now move on with the alternating approach. So I'll recognize Ranking Member Gibbs.
Thank you, Chairman. To Mr. Cordero and Mr. Wilkins, as we've seen in testimony and see the backup, especially in the California ports, and we see backhauling of empty containers back to China to fill a quicker turnaround. For Mr. Cordero, have you seen containers not be available to ag exports? And then for Mr. Wilkins, are you seeing an increased trade on the river system, on the waterways that you are president? Going to more containers to the bulk. So I just got kind of idea of what's going on with the ag exports.
Ranking Member Gibbs, excellent question. I think that number one, your commentary regarding the importance of American exports is key for us going forward. So with regard to what's happening here in Southern California, and if I may say, many of our container gateways in the United States regarding the volume of imports that we're seeing, number one, that has caused a shortage of empties. Now, I will say that that issue has been mitigated since the end of last year with regard to extra loaders, that is vessels that are being sent specifically with regard to the empty issue, but how does that affect the American exporter? I think what we need to get to is, as we reference the common ground here that you see many of us testifying this morning, Congressman, is the need to upgrade our infrastructure here in the port community in the United States. And more importantly, to upgrade the connectivity, for example, inland ports, so that the American exporter, particularly the American farmer, has a competitive opportunity to the largest market in the world, which is Asia. So I think on that regard, here in Southern California, along with the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, is the largest container gateway in the United States. So to put this into context, in 2020, together with the Port of LA and Long Beach, we moved in excess of 17 million TEUs. That's a tremendous amount of volume. Nevertheless, I think that, again, we're moving forward as ports throughout the nation, and as AAPA chairman of the board, I can represent to you, that is the single most important issue that we're trying to address here in the port community.
Mr. Wilkins, what do you see on the maritime, on the waterways? Mr. Wilkins is there?
Yes, I am. I had to unmute. Sorry, Mr. Gibbs.
Oh, okay.
Yes, on the inland waterway system, we see containers that really move in the Gulf region of the country. There's not a lot of container traffic that moves on the inland waterways as we know it per se. The Snake River is probably the best example of great movements. And the underscoring, we look forward to moving containers in a more robust way on the inland waterways. And there's been a downturn in overall tonnage per se, but the reliability of the system is what's really key. We saw the Coast Guard and the Corps of Engineers work together with maintenance programs to be able to not have a 5-year maintenance program, but of 90 to 120 days. We watched them work together to take it to 2 years over 5 years, which really enhances reliability by those two agencies working together in partnership with industry to ensure that we have the ability to move commerce and say to shippers, bring containers to the waterways and any other cargo, because the system is reliable.
Let me interrupt you. Are you seeing an increase in bulk trade? Bulk trade?
Some bulk trades. I mean, it depends on the commodity. We see grain that moves up and down. Of course, it's cyclical.
Yeah, I just seen an increase because they can't move by container out of LA and Long Beach. You see any increase or not?
Not for the inland waterways, no, sir.
Okay, I just have one more question, quick time to Mr. Wilkins. It's an issue outside of today's topic, but many towing vessels response plans. However, now that such vessels are subject to inspection under subchapter M, the geographic restrictions included the towing vessel's certificate of inspection will not allow these vessels to continue signing up as response vessels. Congress recently enacted. Do you expect towing vessels to make the needed upgrades to be able to expand the geographic restrictions on their certificate of inspections to continue to work on response vessels? Mr. Wilkins.
Well, unfortunately, you broke up, Mr. Gibbs. I think you're asking about the inspections and the inspection fees. I believe that's where you're asking.
Yeah, subchapter M, geographic restrictions with certificates of inspections. Yeah, the vessels that were granted a short-term waiver, I guess, but do you see it continue to work in response vessels?
Yes, on the moratorium, we thank the committee for its leadership in drafting legislation that was able to have a moratorium on these fees, because bottom line is, for time, we see the fees that we're paying to the Coast Guard plus TPOs, third-party operators, as being duplicative and redundant. We pay between Illinois Marine Towing and Canal Barge upwards of $33,000 a year just for TPO third-party inspections, and then the Coast Guard. So the bottom line for us is that we don't see where the Coast Guard is doing 20% of the work versus the TPOs doing 100% of the work, the fees are relatively the same. So we think that's duplicative and redundant. So there's an opportunity to improve there.
I think I'm out of time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. I'll proceed to recognize myself. Mr. Patty, unlike other agencies within the Department of Transportation, the Maritime Administration is not tasked with regulating the commercial maritime industry. Instead, and by statute, their job is to promote the industry. In a couple months, the Maritime Administration will testify before the committee on their proposed budget. If you had a message for Merit, what would it be?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me preface my answer by just thanking the incredibly hardworking, dedicated people at the Maritime Administration, especially over these past 4 years. They have worked tirelessly in light of the pandemic and before that in support of our industry. If I had a message for the Maritime Administration, it really would be twofold. First, I would encourage the Maritime Administration to be aggressive in its role as a promotional agency for our industry. We now have a president who has lent his name to a number of maritime policy objectives, and who has recently issued an executive order, including not only the Jones Act, but maritime services within its scope. I would encourage the Maritime Administration to use that to make sure all federal shipper agencies understand not only what the law of the land is, but what the policy of the administration is, so that Ship American is as strongly enforced as Buy American. And secondly, I would encourage the Maritime Administration in its role as the promotional agency to be innovative, to work with the Congress, with their colleagues in the Department of Transportation and the administration, and with the industry. Look at new ways or rehash the old ways to increase the amount of cargo on U.S. flag ships. They should start now looking at the newly enacted Tanker Security Program, to figure out ways to ensure that the vessels that we hope will come in under the United States flag pursuant to this program will in fact have the cargo they need to operate. Look at the tax laws. Consider whether it's time to extend the foreign source income exclusion to American mariners, the way most other maritime nations do. To consider as we approach another tax bill, should there be incentives? Can there be incentives that would encourage shippers use U.S. flag vessels to a much greater extent than they are right now? Look at trade policy. Encourage the promotion and the negotiation of bilateral cargo sharing agreements with our trading partners. Again, with an eye toward increasing the amount of cargo carried on U.S. flag vessels, to increase the number of ships under our flag and to increase maritime jobs. So in short, I would encourage MARAD to be aggressive and to be innovative. And hopefully by working together, we can build up our maritime industry.
Thank you, Mr. Patty. Given the pandemic, have you had problems with recruitment and retention? And what are the implications in the very near future, 5 to 10 years?
Well, there's, again, as we've said, there's absolutely no question the pandemic has adversely affected American mariners, as it has affected all Americans, regardless of the industry in which they work. For the American mariner, the hardships that they have endured, being stuck overseas months upon months after they were supposed to return home to take care of their families, being quarantined on vessels, not being able to have the immediate access to vaccines they need for all of the reasons I had mentioned previously. Despite all of that, morale in the maritime industry among the American mariners is still good. We have not experienced a situation where people are leaving the industry. We have not had a problem recruiting new members to the maritime industry, either through the maritime academies, through Kings Point, through the unlicensed schools. Individuals are still willing and ready and able to work on board U.S. flag vessels. Needless to say, we have to continue to address the pandemic. We have to resolve these issues. And most importantly, if we're talking really recruitment and retention for the maritime industry, we have to make sure we have the ships under the U.S. flag that will provide these individuals with jobs.
And Mr. Patty, finally, when a crew member aboard a ship is infected and the vessel is in a foreign port, what are the remedies or protocols currently in place to provide medical care for the crew members and avoid community spread on the vessel?
Mr. Chairman, that varies. It varies quite a bit from where the vessel is located. In some jurisdictions, the entire vessel and the entire crew will be placed into quarantine. The vessel will have to be cleaned. There will be a specified amount of time based on what the local authorities say before the vessel can sail, before the crew members are removed from the vessel and either taken to a hospital or brought home. So again, it's not a very, very consistent system. It begins and ends really where the vessel is located.
Thank you very much. My time is up, so we'll proceed to Representative Van Drew. You need to unmute yourself, Mr. Van Drew.
Hello, how are you? It is good to be with all of you today, and I think this is an important hearing, and I'd like to congratulate everybody on their posts, obviously. I'd first like to say how important, and I think everybody knows that, the Coast Guard is in my community. We are actually a Coast Guard community in Cape May itself, and we also have the training center for the United States of America. So this is all extremely important, and I'm glad that we're focusing on it. You know, so South Jersey, where I live, people think of New Jersey, but South Jersey is a highly coastal district, and it depends on maritime industries, including fishing, shipbuilding, and maritime shipping. We need to keep the United States extremely economically competitive, and maritime commerce is essential to that mission. And we must always, always support the Jones Act, which ensures that all vessels transiting cargo between domestic ports, as we all know here, are made in the United States. This policy is important for economic and military security and has broad bipartisan support, which is a good thing. And I hope we have a lot of bipartisan support in this committee as we move forward. I have a question for President Del Wilkins. I would ask him, as the president of a towboat and barge company in a major market, you're in a unique position to help educate us as to why investments in maritime infrastructure are urgently needed. What action should Congress take on maritime infrastructure to improve the United States' commercial maritime competitiveness? Thank you, Mr. Del Wilkins.
Thank you, Representative Drew, for the question. I appreciate it. You know, I think I have a very unique life experience on my resume. I was blessed to serve 15 years in South America, Venezuela, Brazil, and Argentina. I've done exploratories in China, on the Yangtze, in Africa, on various rivers, also in Europe. And I would say to you that infrastructure is key. There is no country on the planet that can move commerce like we do here in the United States, especially with this network of barge, rail, and truck, especially maritime. So therefore, it's incumbent upon us, in my opinion, to I think it was Lee Iacocca or General Patton that once said, lead, follow, or get out of the way. So we're leading, and I can assure you that those other countries are trying to replicate what we have. So I think that's how critical it is to maintain the infrastructure that we have in place and enhance it. But others are trying to do what we already have.
Okay, well, thank you for the answer. I look forward to working with you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Van Drew. I will now recognize Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to do this very slowly because a lot of my questions have been asked, and so I wanted to yield to Mr. Lowenthal my 5 minutes, if he's prepared. So I yield to Mr. Allen, Representative Alan Lowenthal.
Mr. Lowenthal?
Prepared. I am prepared. Thank you. First, I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, and congratulate you on your becoming the chair. I think we're going to enjoy working with you, and I think you're going to bring a certain amount of humor to this committee, which I think subcommittee. And I also want to thank the panel for their testimony, and it's illustrated at how important the maritime industry has become through this pandemic crisis. Workers are on the front line. They're putting themselves at risk so that we can move vital goods across our country. You've done your part, and now Congress must do its. I also want to ask unanimous consent to introduce a letter from the American Association of Port Authorities highlighting the impact of the COVID pandemic on maritime operations. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chair.
Without objection?
I will take that as giving me unanimous consent to introduce the letter. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Cordero, you know, I've known you for over two generations, two decades, probably a lot longer. And I really want to say that you have really become a leader, maybe the leader in the U.S. maritime industry. I watched you first as a member of the Long Beach Harbor Department, Harbor Commission, where you championed the fact that the Port of Long Beach could be both an economic engine, could continue to grow, as you mentioned now in your talk today, but also could grow greener. Then you became a member of appointed by President Obama to the Federal Maritime Commission, where you demonstrated your leadership and actually was selected by the president to become the chair of the Federal Maritime Commission. And then you came back to become the executive director of the Long Beach Port, and also the now as the chair of the executive committee of the American Association of Port Authorities. Quite a career. But I want to say, you know, you talked about how federal funds for the Maritime Transportation System Emergency Relief Program could be used to help port workers. Can you give us some idea how could those federal funds help such things right now? What would you use those funds for? And maybe also to talk about what are we going to do about the backlog of goods? I look out my window sometimes here in Long Beach and I see all those ships waiting to unload their cargo, and yet they're sitting out in the port. What are we going to do about the backlog, and how can the Federal Emergency Relief Program help on something like that?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for your question. And let me answer the twofold question as follows. With regard to the funds, I think, first of all, many of you who I see here, I met in my role as chairman of the FNC, you know, Congressman Weber, Congressman Graves, yourself, Congressman Lowenthal, and a couple other familiar faces. So the historic quest of the maritime industry is to be seen as an important vital sector of transportation as we see other modes that are being funded. And, you know, Chairman DeFazio said this morning, and I will say, that the port industry here has yet to receive any relief and funding with regard to this COVID crisis. So if I could leave one thing here with this committee and the subcommittee, again, we just want to have a percentile of relief here that is so important for the vital reasons that, again, you've heard the testimony this morning. Now, with regard to the funding, I think I would direct myself to the National Defense Act here that was recently passed. And more specifically, Section 3505, which established the Maritime Transportation System Emergency Relief Program. And with that, if you look to Section J, I think that answers the question. Everything with regard to operations and how we've been impacted, PPEs, workforce retention, infrastructure repair, and so forth and so forth. The list is long. So I think all I would reference to the answer is, if we apply Section 3505J by definition of what's an emergency here, a health pandemic here, COVID-19, and how this has impacted the port authorities. And I think finally, again, what we're asking for is a vital part of the transportation sector here has yet to receive any funding with regard to this emergency crisis that we've experienced. So as to the part two, and the congestion, as I indicated, I think it's fair to say that we're seeing that in many gateways, but more particularly in Southern California. I think for the Port of Long Beach, you've seen that investment of over $4 billion over 10 years, and going forward, an additional $1.7 billion. Our colleague, our neighbor Port of LA has similar investments. So Southern California is the gateway to the most important trade route in the United States, the Trans-Pacific trade route. And I will say, let's not just see this as an import dynamic. We have to see this as an export dynamic going forward. And that is the reason why, again, we're applying all aspects to move efficiency here with containers. And in a way that my last comment is in terms of funding, a large part of what we need to do is the move to digital transformation. And I think that's going to create the kind of efficiencies that we need to have here at our port gateways throughout the country.
Thank you, Chairman Cordero. I yield back, and I thank Representative Larson for giving me his time.
Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal, Mr. Larson. I will now proceed to Representative Malliotakis. Did I say that correctly?
It's good. For some reason, everyone's having trouble with my first name. I've been called Nickel and Nicholas, but everyone's getting Malliotakis right, which is very nice, and I appreciate Chairman and Ranking Member Gibbs. This is my first time participating in a hearing as a member, and I'm very excited to be here. I really found the testimony to be very enlightening, and in particular, Mike Roberts touched on an issue that I have also concerns with, the influence of China. And in addition to investment China is making in maritime vessels and supplies, it is also making significant investment in infrastructure, such as in ports with our neighboring countries in Latin America and South America. And I was wondering if Mike Roberts or anyone else who testified would like to expand and maybe talk about the impact that this is having on trade with those particular nations in Latin and South America and the maritime industry as a whole.
Thank you, Representative Malliotakis. Appreciate the question. I would say a couple of things. First, this subcommittee a year and a half ago held a hearing on this subject, and it was certainly one of the first times that the impact of China's ambitions was brought to light with respect to the maritime industry. And we've done a lot of work since then to explore that further. We think it's serious. I think the question is, what do we do about it? We don't really have a response. We have a seriously risky situation, a great vulnerability, and we don't have a strong policy response. I think we need to recognize that because of our trade and economic policies, we are a nation of consumers, and that may be fine in a world where there's no threats, but that's not the world we live in today. So we have to recognize that. We have to also understand that there is an economic component to this, that overwhelming military superiority, if we can sustain it, doesn't prevent China from using economic leverage against our interests. So I think to respond effectively, we need to really deny China success in terms of its maritime ambitions. We need a policy that, an industrial policy that balances the benefits of trade alongside the need to preserve a strong and diversified American economy. And key sectors like shipbuilding and strategic service sectors like shipping need to be recognized and supported much more than they are today.
No, I appreciate that. And I think in addition to the Jones Act and our supply chain in terms of the maritime and shipping industries, I think we could also look at the supply chain of PPE. And I was wondering if anyone perhaps could comment on some of the challenges that we as a nation have had obtaining PPE from overseas, from Asia, during the pandemic, and how it highlights the need to bring that supply chain home as well.
I'll offer my 2 cents on it. My sense of it is that early in the pandemic, the Chinese made a rational decision to make sure they had enough PPE for their own population. And as that became less of a stress, they were willing at that point to go ahead with contracts that enabled shipments to this country. It is, I think, widely recognized the importance of near sourcing, in-sourcing critical supplies like PPE and many other things that we're now dependent on China for manufacturing and then for the logistics to bring it here.
Thank you.
And Congresswoman, if I may add to that question, and that's a great question, Congresswoman, let me add this. Part of the question in terms of this issue of congestion at our ports, let's keep in mind there's a confluence of factors as to what has led to the volume. The one commodity aspect that's been very, very key here and important is the number of PPEs and medical supplies that are coming in as imports. That's one of the reasons we've had this surge in volume. So I think the question for us as a nation, that these important medical supplies and PPEs have to be here, come back to be manufactured in the United States. We've seen that in this crisis, if it teaches us anything, that we need to have a quick pivot to make sure we protect frontline workers. And again, if we go back a year and for the first several months thereafter, that was really problematic. And going forward, I don't see any reduction in the use of PPEs in terms of what this pandemic has now changed in terms of what Americans had to be accustomed to for a few years.
Thank you, Mr. Cordero. I absolutely agree with you. And I would actually like to speak with you offline on another issue related to high tolls at my port, because while everyone else is crowded, we're not as crowded because of this type of impact on my local terminal. So let's connect offline. Thank you.
Absolutely. We'd love to do that.
Would there be time to weigh on her first question, Mr. Chairman?
Time is up. We're going to have a second round in a few, so hold that answer. Next, we'll proceed to Representative Lowenthal, a second bite at the apple.
Thank you, and it tastes very good, Mr. Chair, that apple. I want to follow up on some things that Mr. Patty has said. You know, Mr. Patty, you've really demonstrated that this pandemic has exacerbated the current state of the U.S. flag international merchant fleet, which is already at risk. And now you've indicated how much more at risk it's become. So I want to talk about what we can do. Can you this past Congress, we passed and put into the National Defense Authorization Act the 10-tanker security fleet that you mentioned to begin to fund that. But it hasn't been appropriated. How important is it for us to fight to appropriate the tanker security program?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. I think it's incredibly important that we do fight to appropriate the funds. The $60 million is authorized for the new tanker security fleet program. Not only will this help alleviate some of the manpower shortage, if you're talking about 10 vessels coming into the United States flag for the first time, you're talking about an employment base for approximately 500 mariners, which is a nice step in the right direction. Doesn't obviously solve the entire shortage that's estimated, as I said, for approximately 1,800 mariners, but it's a step in the right direction. But I would also suggest that not only do we have to fight to secure the appropriation for that program, but we also need to begin now to look very, very carefully at the program to make sure that when those vessels do come into the United States flag, that there is cargo for them to carry, that they are able to operate, as opposed to just bringing in more vessels to the U.S. flag that are going to be laid up. It's an incredibly important program. It was initiated based on statements that had been made by the Department of Defense, warning of our almost total reliance on foreign vessels to supply the military. And again, the simple answer to your question is yes, absolutely. We should fight to get that appropriation.
Thank you. I want to ask the following question to return to Mr. Cordero, Chairman Cordero. I believe that this committee and certainly Chairman DeFazio has indicated we will be supportive of the need for vaccinations and testing for the maritime industry. You are essential workers. You are not receiving those, and it's critically important for the health of your workers who are essential workers and defending our nation. But I want to ask you about something we've seen throughout this country. We've seen the CDC, we've seen Dr. Fauci, we've talked about public health recommendations, and yet we still see super spreader events, people not following them. I guess the question that I'm asking is, the AAPA has made wonderful recommendations about public health, how we should have best practices, social distancing, PPE. The question to you is, as the chair of the AAPA, have you found that these are really being followed in the ports? When we just recommend is that enough? And what practices in the future, if we have other pandemics, are we going to need to make sure that we do not have super spreader events anymore? And apparently that we're beginning to see those in the ports.
Thank you for your question, Congressman Lowenthal. Let me just say this. As chairman of the board of AAPA, I can represent to this committee that our major container gateways are doing everything possible to put in place these protocols, whether it's the Port of Virginia and my colleague at the Port of Houston, and of course here Long Beach and Los Angeles. And I say here locally in Southern California, I have to commend the IOWU and the Pacific Maritime Association who came together to address this issue. So the bottom line is, I think management and both labor are implementing this protocols because it's very key for the frontline workers. And going forward, let me just say this. 9/11 changed the whole dynamic in terms of how this country viewed our security. I would suggest that COVID-19 now is changing the whole dynamic in terms of how this country is now moving forward with how we address health pandemics. Because again, going forward, I think that nothing's going to change in the future in terms of how we need to be extremely cognizant of health and safety of the frontline workers. And last, I will say this. I think clearly as you look forward in terms of what our practices are going forward, I think it's going to be paramount for us to have, as the Congressman mentioned, adequate PPEs and medical supplies related to health pandemics. Because again, one thing I will say for port authorities, aside from the fact that we have not been the beneficiaries of port relief, is this operation has never closed down. Not one day. There's no one port across the United States
you sum
that
up,
this essential
please?
operation closed down. So with that, again, I appreciate the time and the question, Congressman, and I appreciate the subcommittee again listening to what you've seen here from our testimony here regarding the vital need of the maritime industry.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. Next, we'll proceed to Representative Gallagher, who I see is sporting a jersey in his background of a team that almost made it into the Super Bowl.
That was a low blow, Salud. That was a very low blow. And this jersey is officially cursed. Well, thank you. This is a question for Mr. Wilkins, probably, at the risk of repeating an area of questioning that Mr. Gibbs had raised earlier, I believe. Mr. Wilkins, you mentioned inspection user fees towards the end of your testimony. Last year, the House passed a Coast Guard bill that included language placing a moratorium on those fees for vessels that utilize safety management systems, which was removed when the bill was attached to NDAA. Can you confirm that congressional action on a moratorium is still needed? And how are these fees affecting your bottom line and that of other companies in the industry?
Well, thank you, Mr. Gallagher, for the question. Yes, I would thank the committee and leadership for drafting that legislation, and certainly it was as a big help to us. And respectfully, when we look at these fees, I think I mentioned that the structure of the fees could be duplicative and inequitable in a sense that companies like myself, we use TPOs, third-party agencies, to come in and do the inspections. The Coast Guard also has a fee structure for these inspections for the vessels to be in compliance. And I have mentioned the fact that when we pay the TPOs, our companies will have annual costs of around $30,000 a year, just in the TPO, over and above paying the Coast Guard fees as well. So certainly it helps to, I think the effort is to be able to ensure that the annual fee structure is fair, and to ensure that if we are going to have the inspection protocols, which we should under Subchapter M, we have to ensure that the Coast Guard does not, have a fee when not doing the work, and whereas we have the TPOs doing the work, makes it, if you will, best for us in a sense of fees. The urge would be, the ask would be, let's finish the job to ensure that the moratorium on the fees for the TSMS for the vessels until the Coast Guard establishes a new user fee structure that differentiates the two inspection options that we have.
I appreciate that, Mr. Wilkins. Maybe as a follow-up, in last week's hearing, we heard that mariners living in one state are not given reciprocity in another state for their position in line for the vaccine. I've heard from mariners in my district who are making port calls elsewhere in the Great Lakes that this is a problem. So I don't know who this would go to, but is the fix as simple as Congress mandating that states honor the position in line granted by another state, or would this cause impossible logistical problems in states that honor such a reciprocity? Do you think this is an important issue? I just throw that out to the panel with the time I have remaining.
Well, if I could field that, I would say that there's very few mariners right now who are getting and qualify for vaccinations unless they meet the age requirements. And we have some fourth quarter players who are meeting those age requirements. And currently we're classified by DHS under Group 1C. So if we were to move to 1B as a central workforce, as established again by DHS, we'll handle the logistics because in our organization, we have mariners who are living in more than 25 states across the country, traveling all the time. So it might not be really advisable for them to be able to go and get the vaccines they need in the states, given their time on board and time away from home. So there is logistics challenges. I think we can manage that if, in fact, we can move the statutes up and give guidance to have us moving again to 1B, because we are our critical essential workers, and would certainly prioritize our being able to keep vessels running, keep operations moving, and meet the needs of having our mariners vaccinated, because they live, I think it was mentioned by one of the panelists, we live in tight quarters, and we bear a lot of costs trying to ensure the viability of operations and maintaining production by keeping our mariners safe. And at expense of cleaning, disinfecting, I mean, go on and on, but it certainly would be advantageous to have guidance.
Right. Well, thank you, Mr. Wilkins. And I like the term for fourth quarter players as the representative from Green Bay. That metaphor takes on added significance. So I appreciate that, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Callaghan. We'll proceed with Representative Pappas.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know everyone on this committee is a first quarter player right now, so glad we're fresh and ready for the new term. But I really appreciate the panel here today. I think you gave a good overview of the challenges that we face in the maritime industry, how Congress can play a role moving forward. And I think what's critically important for us to all understand is the central nature that the maritime industry plays in the health and well-being of this country, in its economic future, and certainly as it pertains to our national security as well. I'm glad a number of you have asked questions, and our panelists have commented on the vaccination issue. I think this is clearly a place where the federal government needs to play an increasing role, as Mr. Wilkins just said. With increased guidance, I would recommend as well and support federal testing sites to make sure that we are dealing with our frontline essential workers who are putting themselves on the line each and every day. I think Ms. Brand in her comments said pretty clearly that infections are at crisis levels at some of our ports. And what we can't afford to have happen is any disruption in our supply chains and in the supplies that we are all relying on to get through this pandemic. A lot of it has been said as well about the Jones Act, and I think most of this committee understands the essential nature of the Jones Act in protecting our national security and ensuring that the industry is strong moving forward. I'm wondering if anyone here can speak directly to how having American workers trained to serve on American ships, as the Jones Act requires, has helped us, especially as it pertains to this pandemic, to keep goods moving.
Well, I'll take a crack at that, Congressman Mike Roberts with the American Maritime Partnership. There was a recent study, I guess maybe a year ago, that showed that out of the maritime workforce needed to crew ships in response to an incident, a military contingency, the minimum number needed, we would be 30+% short of meeting that minimum need if we didn't have the mariners from the domestic maritime industry. The Jones Act would supply those mariners, and they do supply those mariners in activations and war game type scenarios, turbo activations. So it is critical that we have American mariners available from the domestic maritime industry for national security purposes generally, and certainly, I think how they performed in the context of this pandemic and bringing supplies in places where they're not, as Jim Petty said, where they're not, their conditions of employment have gone downhill dramatically over the past year as a result of the pandemic. But they persevere, they come through, they show up as merchant mariners do throughout history. So I'm proud to be associated with this community, and I think they really are a critical asset to our national security.
If I can, Congressman, just to pick up a little bit on what Mr. Roberts said, I would echo essentially everything he said as it pertains to the mariners working aboard our U.S. flag vessels in the foreign trades. From the very early stages of the pandemic, when nobody really knew the degree to which it was going to affect maritime transportation, whether it was going to get worse much quicker and much more severe than it did. But the mariners did show up. The mariners continued to perform. They continued to go to work. They complied with the guidelines that were put in place, ranging from having to wear masks and social distancing when they're in the union hall trying to get their next job to ship out, to the shipping companies themselves putting out the expense, absorbing the expense of flying mariners home when their rotation were done because there was no other way to do it. But as I said earlier, despite all of this and throughout all of that, the mariners have taken their responsibilities very, very seriously. When our mariners go to sea, they do so knowing that their first and most important objective is to support our country. It's to support the military, it's to support American troops, and it's to do whatever they can to make sure the sea lanes remain open for our trade. So again, as Mike said, it's very, very humbling to be associated with this industry, and especially have the privilege, as I do, to represent maritime labor.
Well, terrific. I appreciate those comments. I'd like to get one more quick question, if I can. And switching gears a little bit, some of you have alluded to workforce challenges, and I think the COVID epidemic has highlighted a lot of the problems that have always been present in this country around diversity and inclusion. And so my question for anyone on the panel that would like to take it up is the maritime industry doing a good job of promoting diversity and inclusion? Are there any impediments or challenges in the way of making the industry more inclusive? Because I'm trying to figure out what we can do potentially in Congress to help support a growing diverse workforce, make sure the incentives are in the right place, and help build the right culture for the industry as we move forward.
Mr. Pappas, I'm going to ask that those answers be provided for the record to be consistent with our previous colleague who didn't get one of their questions answered when they ran out of time. So
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So with that, we will now go to Representative Weber.
Okay, there I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations on your new post. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. Lots of questions. Let me start with Ranking Member Gibbs said that he understood there were 300,000 mariners stranded. And I didn't really ever hear, was there an answer to that? Stranded around the country, around the globe? How do we get that answer?
Congressman, if I can, Jim Patty, most of those mariners, almost all of those mariners now are foreign nationals working aboard foreign vessels, many of which we would define as flag of convenience ships, where there's virtually no legal relationship with the flag of the vessel and the vessel's owner. And most of these mariners have literally been abandoned by their ship owner, by the charterer, by their flag nation, and are desperately trying to just in some way, shape, or form get home. They're on these ships with virtually no food. They're on these ships. They have not been paid. Some of them have been on these ships for well over a year. So it is a very, very serious humanitarian issue. Good news is it's not affecting the American mariner, but as sailors and Brotherhood of the Sea, it is an incredibly serious humanitarian issue.
Right. Thank you for that. And I want to jump over to Mr. Bordelon now, if I may. Glad to hear that his grandfather started a business building ships. but so much of our manufacturing has gone overseas, especially heavy manufacturing, whether it's Japan, South Korea, wherever. And we've talked about China building, what was it, 1,800, vessels, whatever it was. Mr. Bordelon, how do we compete? How do we, from the business standpoint, how do we get manufacturing of those vessels back here?
Thank you, sir, for the question and opportunity. There's a lot was said over the last, I guess, couple of hour and a half. We've been talking about it, and China's name comes up, and foreign competitors come up. But we continue as a nation to further develop ourselves and be competitive. I think we've responded really well in leading technology on different fronts, in different facilities and different manufacturing, not just in shipbuilding, but specifically in shipbuilding. And we need to continue to do that. Some of the shipbuilding grants that have been done through MARAD have helped the shipbuilders do that. That's one opportunity. But really, the biggest thing for us to remain competitive and be a leader, because that's, I think, often overlooked, is that, you talk about free trade or fair trade, and we care about fair trade, and we care about national defense and security. All of those things are important for us. We pay taxes, we keep our people safe, we follow OSHA, we don't pollute the world like other places do. So giving us the opportunity to continue to be a leading edge. Some of the biggest things we need, I'm gonna say it again, we need some visibility and consistency in budgets that can keep our manufacturing in a position where we have a great competitive workforce, that you're offering careers to people that you can effectively train, and then the obvious reinvestment comes with that. My grandfather was a machinist by trade, uneducated, and he bought an old lathe and a drill press, and that's how he got started. And his philosophy was he was going to keep improving and keep investing in his business. And with some kind of sustainability and vision with, U.S. shipbuilding, as far as the U.S. Navy goes, the Army has projects, obviously the Coast Guard, and the commerciality. All of those things help keep us competitive and reinvesting. So I think those are the key things, Congressman, that could help us continue to push forward and be more competitive in the world that we living in today in shipbuilding.
All right, thank you for that. I'm going to move on to Mr. Cordero now. Mr. Cordero, you cited I think it was 1,497 COVID cases, and you may or may not have this percentage. What percentage of the workforce, of the Mariner workforce, would you say that is?
Well, it varies, Congressman, from port to port, region to region. But let me just answer the question generally. It's a high percentage, and let me just give you some data. We talked about testing, which is a very important component to this. So for the Port of Long Beach, we put in place the only COVID testing site in the port complex. Our commission supported us in authorizing $1 million to set up that test site back in August of 2020. And in November, our commission authorized another $3 million so that we could have that test site open through July of 2021. So that right there is a $4 million investment by the Port of Long Beach. What has that resulted in? From August to the present date, I can represent to the subcommittee, we tested over 20,000 people at that site. So obviously, we have to be proactive with testing. But the other aspect in terms of going back to the funding question is rapid testing. That's what we need. And last, I will say this. What I have here is a KN95 mask. To the question of PPEs, let me just say that in the industry, when this pandemic hit, many of our frontline workers were wearing basically cloth masks. I mean, it was really unfortunate that we were in that situation. But what we need in this country is for every frontline worker to have an N95 mask made in the United States. That's what we need. It's not a question of just an ordinary PPE. It's the quality of PPE.
You could summarize, please.
So I hope that answered your question, Congressman, and thank you so much for your question.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber. Next, we'll go to Representative Auchincloss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the panel. I wanted to pivot to something that was mentioned in your written testimony, Mr. Roberts, about offshore wind as an important emerging market for the maritime industry. Offshore wind has the potential to produce tens of thousands of jobs nationwide, including many in southeastern Massachusetts in my district, and could play a significant role in decarbonizing electricity production in the United States. In your written testimony, Mr. Roberts, you specifically called out as ways to encourage offshore wind. Regulatory measures needing intention include a more predictable permitting process, a possible regional approach to local content requirements, prompt Coast Guard regulatory actions related to the vessels required to install and service offshore wind turbines, and support and planning for the necessary port infrastructure. I want to invite you to take 2 minutes and talk about which of those might be the highest impact and how the federal government might assist.
Great, thank you for your question. We are, as you may have gathered, we're very excited about the prospect of offshore wind development and being part of that, and the economic benefits and job benefits that it will provide. We are, frankly, very early in this industry's development. When I talk about the permitting process, I think the change in administrations will see. I'm fairly confident we'll see a more predictable and responsive permitting system put in place that will help a lot with respect to Coast Guard and other regulatory areas. And I think that really is the starting place, knowing that having the licenses in place and having all of that kind of going is great, but having the authority to go ahead with the development is really critical. Obviously, it needs to be done safely with full accommodation for all of the stakeholders, fishing and other stakeholders that could be affected by it. But I think that getting that done quickly and getting right is very important. Coast Guard regulation of vessels. Some of them are very new vessels that are not in the fleet today, and so making sure that we have clarity and a good collaborative ability to work through regulatory issues is critically important also. So those are two I would just mention.
One way that has been, and Mr. Roberts, this is still, I think, in your wheelhouse, one way that has been promoted by some advocates in my district has been offshore wind opportunity zones that could receive accelerated permitting and priority consideration for federal infrastructure investments. Would you support that designation? And if so, are there components of it that you would advocate for?
Well, I'm not familiar with that specific program. I would say that certainly another area of attention is with respect to the ports themselves and the need to develop logistics capabilities at the ports, and that sounds like it probably is something that would fit well within the opportunity zones that you're talking about there.
Thank you. And final question, this is for anybody on the panel, although Mr. Roberts, perhaps you can have first pass. Bristol Community College serves my constituents, building a state-of-the-art National Offshore Wind Institute to ensure a workforce that is ready for this new industry. Can you describe the nature of the jobs and the sort of directionally the volume of the jobs that can be created for this industry?
I'll mention it from a maritime perspective. There are so many different elements to doing offshore development, and some of this is certainly learning from the offshore oil and gas development industry. But you need to be able to install the facility, put foundations in, and you need vessels and you need mariners who know how to operate those ships and do that very heavy engineering work. You'll need to be able to link those installations back to shore using cables instead of pipelines. We will need service vessels to maintain them over many years, and mariners and technicians to be able to operate those vessels. Just sort of from a maritime perspective, that's a snapshot.
Sir, this is Lauren Brand. May I also respond to this quickly? So this will also create terminal opportunities and opportunities for logisticians. The offshore wind is high, wide, and heavy cargo. I know of one case where we should have seen some product go from the Gulf area to the Northeast area by marine highway, by vessel, and instead it went by truck, and it took over 6 months to move that way. And they actually went through intersections where they had to take down the signal lights because the equipment was too high to fit under the overroad obstacles. So it's a great logistics thing, great terminal thing. If there's a way I can help, let me know.
I appreciate that, and I'll yield back my time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next, we will proceed to Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying it's a pleasure to be able to serve with you under your leadership on this committee. You and I served together on both the House Armed Services Committee and Transportation Infrastructure Committee. The only frustrating part about that is that I am sitting behind you in seniority on both of those committees. But in all seriousness, it's a pleasure, it's an honor to be able to serve with you. And I think really appropriate because I think the work that we do on transportation and infrastructure, the policy, the authorities, the investments in infrastructure, perhaps are just as important to national security as the work that we do together on the House Armed Services Committee. As we've been hearing throughout the testimony today, obviously public ports in the United States playing an indispensable role in local and regional economies throughout the nation. And the COVID-19 pandemic has had a tremendous impact on the industry in 2020. I have a particular interest in the Port of Baltimore, which is arguably the most diverse port on the East Coast. It has a portfolio of containers, automobiles, farm equipment, roll-on, roll-off cargo, and forest products. And it is ranked first among all U.S. ports in the volume of vehicle cargo for 9 consecutive years. Key cargo commodities at the Port of Baltimore's public terminals were down for the year compared to 2019, but the port's strong recovery in the second half of the year helped dramatically narrow those declines. The port's strong finish in 2020, I think, reflects highly on Maryland's economy and the dedication of our port workforce. However, if we are going to continue to ensure that our nation's ports are functioning, meaning that we're supporting frontline port workers who are really key to what we're doing, we have to prioritize testing and vaccination. And at the end of last year or during last year, Congress passed the CARES Act, the NDAA. Both of them included important provisions to help mitigate the virus and the effects it has had on this industry. Both Mr. Cordero and Mr. Patty, and perhaps some of the other panelists, I apologize, but I know that you specifically addressed in your testimony the Maritime Transportation System Emergency Relief Program. And while it was passed in the NDAA, it was the brainchild of this committee. So if Mr. Cordero and Mr. Patty, I mean, look, authorization, we authorized it, now we got to fund it. And could you talk about the need to fund it in 2022 and what happens if we underfund it? What happens if we don't step up and what we need to do as a Congress to support the Maritime Transportation System Emergency Relief Program? Mr. Cordero, Mr. Patty.
Well, thank you, Congressman. And I think a very good question, because you've already heard this morning the impact that COVID-19 has had already to our ports throughout the nation. And I will say that my good friend Bill Doyle over there at the Port of Baltimore is doing a great job, and again, former commissioner of the FMC. But I think as AAPA chairperson, I will say this, that we have a great opportunity, Congressman and subcommittee, to not only fund this program, but earlier there was a question in terms of the question was posed as what will we say to Merit going forward in terms of what an important aspect that needs to be addressed. Merit has a great opportunity right now to advocate on this issue, because they have been identified as the lead federal agency to move forward and identify emergency relief and issue grants to the port authorities across the nation. So that's going to be very key for Merit to move forward with 3505J of the program or of the act, which again, it's going to be very important with all the issues that we've addressed this morning. And failure to do that is going to create a real problematic question in this supply chain, a vital transportation sector. And again, when we talk about imports, exports, 95% of international trade moves by water. Trade begins at the ports.
Mr. Patty?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Congressman. I would just pick up a little bit on what was said and again, strongly encourage Congress to fund this program. There are a number of entities in the maritime industry, ranging from training institutions that the unions and the shipping companies run and operate in order to continue to provide best trained mariners that we possibly can, that have effectively been shut down for most of this past year because ships were not sailing, they were not able to travel to and from the schools. And they desperately need help in order to remain open. There are small passenger vessel operations. There are other shipping companies. all of whom have taken significant hits throughout this pandemic. And look, I think just to emphasize, this legislation does not dictate that money go to anybody. They still have to apply. They still have to apply for the grant. They have to prove that it's worthwhile and necessary. But none of that happens until the money is made available. So on behalf of all of those types of entities, most of whom don't belong to our organization, but nevertheless, I would encourage Congress to provide funding for that program.
Thank you, Mr. Patty. Thank you, panelists. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. That concludes the first round of questions. I'm going to proceed with the second round for anybody interested in asking a second question. And with that, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes and then proceed to other members who may have additional questions. Mr. Brand, in your statement, you said that there are currently 37 container ships sitting outside of the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. What would happen if congestion were to continue to rise? What does that mean for ports and the U.S. economy?
Sir, thank you very much for that question. Right
Ms.
now,
Brand, I apologize for messing that up.
That's all right, sir. It's happened to me my entire career. Because of the vessels that are offshore, right now there's containers that are holding parts for manufacturing and assembly sites in the United States. And we're going to start to see some of those start to falter in their schedules the longer this goes on. I believe yesterday I checked the number, and the number now is down to 32 ships that were offshore. We estimate that that is about 380,000 TEU or 190,000 truckloads of goods. I actually went shopping at one of my favorite local retail stores. It's called Chico's, and I asked them if they had certain spring colors, and they said, no, those are stuck in the port. So we're seeing a decline in the fashion market. We'll see some commodities not come in. Maybe some Valentine's Day things are stuck. We'll see Easter things being stuck, and we'll see things that are actually arriving too late to go to market. So there will be an economic impact for a number of different things, from consumer goods all the way to manufacturing.
Thank you, Ms. Brand. Mr. Wilkins, in your written testimony, you stated that waterborne transportation is the most environmentally friendly mode of transportation. What can Congress do to encourage more shipping by water? What policies would spur the development of coastwise shipping?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. I don't know if I'm prepared to answer the question directly, especially on the coastal side. What I would say is that I think I answered in the sense that having the programs of ensuring reliable lock dams, ports that is maintained and allowing the Corps to do what it does in operating and maintenance of those systems promotes reliability, and reliability promotes confidence, and confidence promotes investment from the shipping world and cargo holders to realize they have a viable means of transport and reliable means of transport. So I would answer that question that way, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Patty?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things I would suggest that Congress look at, and it's something that this committee had been advocating for quite a while in the past, is to look at the application of the harbor maintenance tax on coastwise shipping. The way things work now under the harbor maintenance tax, there is a very unfair, we consider discriminatory double taxation on ships operating in the coastal trade. If you have a large container ship coming in from overseas and your container is the value of that cargo, it's subject to the HMT. When it's reloaded onto these smaller vessels that travel up and down the coast, when it reaches its second destination, it's taxed again. At a minimum, this serves as a tremendous disincentive for shippers to use U.S. flag vessel operations. So it's just another thing to look at as we go forward in this Congress. And I think part of the objective would be to try to eliminate as many of these disincentives as possible that impede the operation of American ships.
Thank you. Ranking Member Gibbs, do you have any additional questions?
Yeah, just a couple. Thank you, Chair. First of all, Mr. Wilkins. In 2020, the Corps of Engineers moved forth a large-scale rehabilitation project on the Illinois River, which necessitated periods of closure on the river. In your opinion, did the Coast Guard and the Army Corps of Engineers manage the process? And if were there any lessons learned that we should know about, Mr. Wilkins?
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. No, I would say that I think that the Coast Guard and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers worked in harmony and worked perfectly together as a partner. I applaud that they listened to industry to reduce having disruptions over a 5-year plan to mitigate that and bring it down to a 2-year plan. So I think the lesson learned is a shining example that industry and the Coast Guard and the Corps of Engineers can work together to accomplish maintaining our infrastructure. So we are very pleased in the way that we came together and a solution.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Ms. Brand, in your testimony, you talked a lot about the vaccines. And since you represent the National Association of Waterfront Employers, are you seeing differences between states where you operate with that vaccine accessibility, or is it just they're not getting it because they haven't declared essential workers? Or what are you seeing within the different areas geographically around the country?
Thank you very much. We wrote to 35 different states, including Puerto Rico, and we received responses from less than half of those. Some basically, sir, what's happening is that the waterfront workers are not getting any priority whatsoever. It's age priority right now. Each state has its own regulations and rules. For example, in Florida, if you're 65 and over, you can be eligible for a vaccine. In Virginia, if you're 75 and older, you can be eligible for a vaccine. So even the age priority has a difference between states. It's very difficult to track.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I believe Representative Malliotakis asked a question and didn't have a chance for the panelists to answer, and I don't know which panel that was. I'll yield my time to that if that person wants to answer Representative Malliotakis' question earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. That was myself, and I was only going to point out to the representative that her question was around the competitive advantage of lack of moving commerce given other nations around the world. And I was going to point out in our last project that Canal Barge did in Colombia, to move a container from Bogota to Cartagena, 660 miles, cost 4 times the amount of money to take the same container 9,000 miles from Cartagena all the way to China. So as they were developing their Magdalena River and other countries looking to develop river systems, we measure productivity on a cost per ton mile basis. So that's our competitive advantage, and underscoring infrastructure was the final point I want to make to her.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Gibbs. Are there any other questions? Seeing none, I would like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony today. Your comments have been very informative and helpful. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you very much.
Okay.